So let's see. Um, Mostly just in the first part of the week, just continued what I was doing in the past week, but in the week before that, where I was just in a state of surrender while also letting it be um, for its own sake and not tracking progress. And at least once, I kind of dropped into like a state where it was like more, um, how would I describe it? I want to say like I cared less about things in general, but it was more, I mean, it was definitely more calmer and I don't know, was it equanimous? It was relieving. And it was um I guess I did kind of like just care less in general, I think. Something like that. And it just continued like that for a while and one thing that was a little bit difficult to figure out was while I was doing the practice with my eyes closed, my eyes kept on gravitating towards noticing the lights behind the eyelids.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew if I let that happen for long enough, my eyes would open automatically, and that may or may not start an episode. So I was like, this I can let this go for like a little bit, but after a little while, I actually have to make my eyes go blank through
Mm-hmm.
various, and it was a bit of a struggle sometimes. Like I was in the state of like allowing, and I was like just allowing the eyes to do whatever they were doing. But after a while, I was like, but there was a concern that was like, but I can't let this go on for too long. So like, I was like, what was it? So I tried to like make the eyes go blank, the vision go blank, which was kind of effortful at times. And so I don't know if that counts as like tracking progress though. Exactly. I feel like it kind of did.
There you go. Yeah, generally when something is, it's very hard or impossible to doubt. It's just obvious. If there's wiggle room, you're unsure because it's not pure, it's tainted. There are parts of you that are just like, yeah, I was doing this for a reason.
I see. Hmm. I guess that makes it kind of difficult then, because like I really have to surrender that desire to be like to manage the vision then, and
Yeah,
just let it do whatever. Even if it goes to an episode, and that's like really intense. And
yeah. It's almost like, you're training yourself to be normal. It's like nobody like tries to manage their vision so they don't have an episode. And you have that capacity too, but you have to go through the crucible of like your associations with not managing your vision. And part of that is being triggered in the fear of an episode. But in the process of confronting your fears, they suddenly start to lose their power over you. And that's how you more and more and more live life independent of the idea that you can't have episodes. And they become a thing of the past. You kind of forget about them. You don't beat them, you don't triumph over them, you just become the kind of person that doesn't get them. Which is where all of my suggestions are coming from. It's changing the way you relate to them so that you no longer attract that kind of shit. And also, just because letting your eyes go certain ways in the past seems to have brought on episodes doesn't mean it always will. You have to let yourself consider the alternate, the positive version of reality of how things might go. Because otherwise, you kind of doom yourself to the self-fulfilling prophecy that it's like, oh, I just can never look that way. I can never have my vision in this state. It's like, I must avoid it at all costs or get out of it as quickly as possible or manage it. It's like, it's living your life in fear out of a part of life. And the funny thing is, it's like, worst case scenarios, episodes are kind of uncomfortable. But you're still fine. You're still fine. And if anything, it's just an interesting metric that reflects like your own evolution, your relationship, their frequency, their duration, the quality of the episodes, because that's changed over time, and it has consistently continued to improve. So rather than manage it and try to make it finally improve and finally finish, just trust. I'm already improving. There's a version of you that is already beyond this. You're just engaged in the process of becoming. But it's only a matter of time. You've set the conditions that'll culminate in that. And the conditions are ever deepening surrender. Because surrender is kind of like letting your presence, your awareness, soak into your body like water pouring into something. Now, your body is thick, it's dense, it's porous, but there are parts that are dry and, like, kind of like it's taken a while for the water to really seep in. So you keep going at it, you give it time, and over time, it sinks into, it absorbs into, soaks into deeper and deeper areas. Some of these deeper areas manage the meta-programming of your associations and reactivities having to do with your episodes. So literally the practices and the learnings will continue to act on your nervous system and improve the way you function. And eventually you'll function so damn well that you don't glitch in that way. That's a different way of putting it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Did you end up going into an episode during our last session after we parted ways, or did you manage to cruise?
No, I went into an episode.
Oh, congratulations. Yeah, it's like you're a weird dude, Kevin, and so am I. We're all kind of weird. Part of this path is just accepting our own unique kinds of weirdnesses that come with their own ups and downs. So I'm a big advocate for surrendering and fully accepting before we jump to try and see something as a problem and something to fix. Because a lot of things kind of fix themselves through the process of surrender. So why not try that first? But it also means you're putting your spiritual path, your relationship with consciousness first. Because you turn everything into fuel for insight. God, is this what it feels like to not have coffee? Is this what normal people feel like? Those poor bastards. Uh, um, yeah, did any other comments or questions come up on anything?
Um, oh, what was it? So I had an opportunity. This was like yesterday, I think. Yeah, this was yesterday. So I was lying down to practice, and it felt different. So I was like in a state of surrender, and I felt a more inclined sort of surrender that was like I was just tired of being put in this box and in these limitations under these restrictions. I was just tired of it. And I felt like there was a possibility for a deeper form of surrender to like open up. And it almost felt like I was free falling in a sense. And well, one thing that kept coming up was like surrendering the managing of the vision because my eyes were closed. And I came kind of close to surrendering it fully, but I was just like I was too tired. I was physically tired, and I didn't feel like making the what's it called? Not the effort, but the willingness to go that far. There was I didn't remember. It's like, what if I just relate to this as sensation and then surrender, which created a depth of its own. But there was something about it that was like, for some reason, it's not. It wasn't full. It didn't feel like a full surrender if I was just relating it to it as sensations. It sort of had to be like, but with the concept as well, and then the full surrender. Relating to it as just sensation felt only like a partial surrender.
Wait, the concept as well? What do you mean the concept as well?
The concept of what was it? Uh, Managing the vision or whatever
Mm-hmm.
the help was. Not
Mm-hmm.
just relating to it as sensations and surrendering to the sensations.
Hmm. Surrendering. I guess that works. Yeah, in a certain way, it's not really like you're surrendering to anything. You're kind of just surrendering. You don't even know what it is there is to surrender. Everything is being surrendered. Your sensations are being surrendered. Because you ever notice how your like sensations are blinking in and out of existence very rapidly, moment by moment?
Um,
um, no, yeah, like if you look for solidity, you can't find solidity.
hmm.
So at its base, everything is kind of constantly shifting and permanent. There are micro states in between what we call sensations, in which they're like gap sensations or non sensations. Um, so yeah, I guess like surrendering to sensation invites the dissolution of the dividedness or the sense of separation between the sensory and the cognitive, which takes you to a deeper level of like coherence and unity, which is very fulfilling and healing. Um, Pure surrender can take you even further. And yeah, and it's not like sometimes we entertain the thing that we're used to doing as if it's still a good option. It's like we've tried to manage these things countless times. It's never really worked out that well in the long term. In terms of inspiring, like, real deep transformation and change. We just continue having to manage it, which is exhausting. And we have tried partially surrender, not completely, not at all times. But it seems that the more we do that, the more it holistically just gets better on its own. So it's really about being strategic and wise about your health and caring about yourself. Because I promise you, there is an understanding where every single application of these ways of shifting and relating with your consciousness are actually logically the answer as well. It's not even necessarily a leap of faith. It's just understanding the mechanics of consciousness and how that expresses at the level of the mind body. Resistance in the mind creates friction and imbalance. Resistance in the body does the same. Flow and ease and connection is what humans call harmony. Where that is reduced, disharmony, dysfunction, dis-ease seems to appear. Since resistance is behind those manifestations, you take out the resistance, which is something within your influence, and things start to improve to the extent that it can, which can be pretty far incomplete. You'd be surprised. Because it's not Kevin that's surrendering, you know? Like, we're never actually having these conversations as people. We're using the context, the appearance of people meeting up and having a reason to and conversing, but what's actually happening is that the deeper intelligence, the silent intelligence that is prior to your mind, prior to your body, that manages the entire show subconsciously, it's listening, it's learning, and little by little it's changing your status quo, your default. And yeah, in that sense, it's literally just a matter of time. Every time you practice, every time you have a session, it's like you're doing a mini update and reconfiguration and debugging on your operating system. And it's like there's a natural order to the operating system. So instead of trying to figure it out and understand programming so that you can debug it yourself with your own mind, you kind of just like get the common denominator of like distortions out of the way, which is resistance, and things naturally fall back to the natural order, to the greater harmony, because you're inseparable from that. This is nature. This is an intrinsically harmonious life. So yeah, it's just being skillful of how you manage your time, attention, and energy. And I guess like a major part of it is like recognizing how so much of what you've done, what you've been doing is resistance, and how it doesn't add up. But it's a fun game. It's a fun game. It's like every single time you have like some insight, some breakthrough, even though it's an uncomfortable situation, it's just like there's this thrill, this exhilaration, this deep fulfillment of, oh, it can be even simpler. And in my opinion, that's more than worth enough the price of admission of like having to go through the crucible of these episodes every once in a while. Um, our experience with suffering, with discomfort, um, those end up being major, major teaching moments if we invite them into insight. And yeah, when there's nothing left to learn, it doesn't bother you in the same way. Ooh, hunger. Interesting. Any comments or questions on anything?
So what about surrendering, what's it called? Surrendering for its own sake versus surrendering for a purpose? Feels like trying to keep that frame of surrendering for its own sake is a little bit less freer than just purely surrendering regardless of whatever the context is, even if it is for a purpose.
Surrendering for its own sake doesn't mean I'm thinking, oh, I'm surrendering just to surrender. It is just surrender regardless of what's happening. That's pure surrender. That means that regardless of what's going on, you're doing surrender. You're doing it for its own sake, independent of context. In terms of for a purpose, it's not so much that either things are for a purpose or they aren't. It's that the artifact of still having it seem as if there's a purpose for this is itself what causes the distortion. And so it'll simply get in the way of how deep it can go. In the context of how this applies and works together, it's not like you assess, is there a purpose for my surrender? And then you either let go of the purpose and then surrender, or you just surrender while there's a purpose. No. You engage the surrender. And part of the flow of the surrender is also letting the sense of a purpose fade. You put yourself on the track to be more and more free, regardless if you're not necessarily the freest or clearest that you are at this moment. And you let yourself ease and open into a pure and fuller form. And in that sense, you don't have to fight, resist, or manage or assess your intentions or motivations beforehand as much. You kind of just go with the flow of opening and melting and falling, and as you notice the things that kind of drag against the flow that create a sense of tangibility, you remind yourself to go lighter. And yeah, purpose is a way of thinking, it's not real. So it's like, it's really a relationship with it when there's no, is it paha? Is it when there's no grab from your consciousness? You can still have ideas of, gee, it would be nice for this to happen. But since there's nothing pushing, pulling, and it's not identified with you, it doesn't inhibit any of the flow in the opening. Does that clear that up for you?
Kind of.
Let's put it this way. Is there anything you would like to use right now for the sake of relief? If is there anything that you would like to relieve right now?
Yeah.
What?
The pressure in my chest.
All right, cool. So don't worry that you have this desire for that to like resolve. Just start letting go. Start opening. Now, surrendering, letting go has its own momentum. It's its own flow. So you're letting yourself slip, ease, melt, fall into that flow, be carried by it. You're realizing that, you know, we seem to initiate with intentionality or what seems to be effort. But once you're kind of in the flow, it's also easy to see that there's an effortless aspect to it. You don't even have to see it in terms of effort. It's kind of just flowing by itself. Now, what do flows do? They do not fight or resist anything that is in their flow. Instead, anything that is harder starts to soften at its own rate. So rather than noticing, yes, there is purpose here, I guess this isn't pure, you simply recognize, the sense of purpose comes with a sense of charge or pressure or tension. Let me just continue including that in the flow and prioritizing the flow. Deepening into the relaxation and the opening, just letting the seeming sense of purpose be there. And there starts to be some relief around the sense of pressure itself, around the sense of purpose as well. And as you go deeper, that starts to change the pressure in your chest too. And this is all cool, but there's side effects. So forget the fact that this is changing anything and just enjoy the fact that something in you is going quieter and quieter, softer and softer. You're approximating more and more and more this deeper possibility of surrender that you tasted before. You don't have to dive in. You can ease and you can take your time getting comfortable, getting closer. And sometimes you do taste it, where you kind of lost the plot or the context. And it's like everything's flowing and happening, but you kind of momentarily forgot that you did anything, why you did anything. It just is what it is, which is a different way of saying, I don't necessarily care. And that's not the same thing as not caring either. It's just neutral, it's pure, it's equanimous. Now, the more you prioritize the surrender, the deeper the holistic effect of surrender is. How does the pressure in your chest feel now?
Lighter.
Do you still have a sense of a purpose or direction or need for this to result in a certain way?
No.
And there you go. You started off with the desire, with the direction, and that's okay. That's just how things seem to be at the moment. You engage in the surrender. And the wisdom is everything that appears starts slowly being drawn in and resolved by the surrender itself. And so, yeah, that's really like the way to go about it. There's nothing in the way of you accessing surrender at any time, regardless of what you're feeling or not, thinking or not. And as you deepen into it, all of your agendas and contexts are slowly passed away too. Oftentimes, at least initially, it'll seem like you're almost like reverse engineering your way back through your constructs. And so the sense of purpose or reason for something is actually more superficial because it's a reaction, it's a response of something deeper that's already happening and that has been happening even before you started interpreting it as bad and I need to fix this. So in going with the flow of surrender, your purpose fades And behind the mask of the purpose is like the energetic biophysiological pressure in your chest. And as you go even further, that starts to resolve too when you start to come upon even a deeper layer that's beneath the pressure of that has more to do with maybe some hidden emotional quality that you hadn't really discovered yet. So the waters of surrender continue soaking in deeper and deeper and deeper. And the things that seem to be important, that seem to be appropriate ways to describe the experience initially, those start to fade because you were just describing how things were before you let surrender get that deep. But as it gets deeper, your relationship and the way everything appears to you is also different. Hence why it's so important on not getting hung up on interpretation, because, same old, same old. By the time you've noted it's as something, it's already changed, but you've crystallized it. You think it's one thing, it's the same thing, but no, it's constantly evolving. It's undefined. You can't put a completely coherent pattern for it. I mean, you could, but it wouldn't be absolutely accurate across all times. And what's more valuable for us is to remain undefined because of the quality of fluidity that engages in our system. Any comments or questions before we proceed?
And what was it called? Not tracking progress, or what was that other one? Letting things letting things not be defined, like not tracking progress, not losing the sense of uh even being able to comment on your progress or keep track of anything, or is it felt like an active thing while I was doing it, but like what you just explained before, like if it's just, it seems like if it's just pure surrender, if I'm just purely surrendering, that's already not tracking the progress. But I don't know. What would you have to say?
You're never actually tracking progress. You can be confused and deluded into perceiving it as tracking progress. The moment you're not thinking about it as tracking progress, you're not really doing it. Now, as you engage in surrender, while initially, especially during the first initial moments, you're no longer tracking progress, that doesn't mean that part of you may not still have a hidden fixation or agenda to occasionally spring up that view. And so I'd say, yes, you are correct. When you engage in pure surrender, you're already not tracking. Does that mean that you will maintain pure and clear and that other kinds of views will not over dominate and kind of dilute or make the surrender seem different for a moment if you don't catch yourself? Um, Depends on how good of a sailor you are. If you kind of just flow and allow everything and really disregard any significance in anything, then it'll remain pretty damn pure. If you still have this habit of like giving credence or like, elevated status to any of these musings, then they might have a little bit more pull than other things, even as you engage in the process of surrender, in which case some resistance or distortion will come up around them. And, the analogy of melting here is, works at the micro level. It's like in the midst of surrender, let the charge and the density and the pressure around this fixation kind of melt itself, dissolve itself, surrender itself. At this point, it all starts to get very trippy because it's a yes and no answer for a lot of things. Um, Suffice to say that the way things seem at the level of the phenomenal, at the level of the physical, that is how things seem at a certain dimension of experience. Surrender engages a deeper level of experience where all the ways of talking at the phenomenal apply less and less and less. At the level of the phenomenal, things can still appear and function the way they normally do. It's not like it has to be a certain way. You can have the appearance of progress without tracking or thinking about progress. You can have the appearance of growth and improvement without thinking about it in those terms. You can have the appearance of what some people consider problems being resolved without you having to think of it as a problem. That is the dimension that surrender invites you to. A silent kind of intelligence where the universal intelligence is kind of taking care of everything for itself. It's this deeper intuitive wisdom that is of a different flavor than the grosser, contracted, individualistic, linear kind of thinking that we're used to. By engaging in the process of surrender and inviting ourselves into a deeper dimension of consciousness, our mind also reconfigures from functioning solely as a human mind that sees things in limited ways and thinks of problems and solutions and chases, to a universal mind that is much more refined, sophisticated, and requires much, much less to get anything done. Does that help clarify that for you?
Have to track how that was answering the question.
Um, Basically, at the dimension where surrender comes from, there has never been any tracking progress. There has never been any more issues. As you engage more fully in surrender, you engage more fully, you make the basis of your operations, the base of your awareness, the dimension of surrender. And where you were coming from, the dimension of the phenomenal, that starts to fade. It gets integrated and included in the process of surrender, but now that becomes silent. And because it is silent, or rather, no inherent meaning given to it, then it loses its resistance. It loses like any of its pressure. It loses the context, the agenda. So the moment that you think and feel into surrender, that moment is already pure. As you proceed and you chain the moments of surrender so that they're continuous and they're the main thing that you're experiencing. You have less and less and less of the moments of I'm viewing things in relative ways. One of the side effects of viewing things in relative ways is the possibility of seeing a problem and tracking things in terms of progress and this, that, and the other. So, yeah, I'm trying to just illuminate that. It's kind of like, it'd be a really good analogy for this. Oh, okay, yeah, sure. Um, let's say you're an ant, and you live in an ant colony, and you have your own ant little ecosystem. You've got some worker ants. You've got like all kinds of different ants. Your job is to gather dung. You got to gather shit. You got to roll up the shit and like bring it as fertilizer for your colony so it can grow fungus, so it can feed the queens, and the queens can get fat and you can continue to procreate. It's a very complex thing. At the level that you're viewing it from as an ant, Jesus, the world is so big. All these gigantic ass leaves and all these gigantic ass like pieces of shit, and like, wow, there are gigantic ass animals. For you as an ant, it might be difficult. It might be an entire day's undertaking to do some of your job. Now consider that you actually had access to being more than that. And that being an ant, you're just really zoomed in, so everything feels small. Or everything feels larger relative to you, but to put it a better way. As you zoom out, everything becomes smaller until you have this bird's eye view, and now it's like, oh, you're a human. There's a lot more space, everything's smaller, easier to handle. What takes an ant an entire day to do, you can just do with like a whim of the movement of your hand. It is so much profoundly easier and simpler to do an entire ant colony's job for yourself from the level of being a human being with enough know-how. That is what you're doing when you're surrendering. When you're not surrendered, you're acting as the ant. You have this very like dramatized and like more difficult seeming worldview in which things require more effort and more complexity. As you zoom out, your frame of reference expands. And so everything seems smaller relative to you and more manageable. When it gets small enough, so small that you can't even perceive it anymore, that's surrender. Everything's taken care of itself. At the level of the ant, you had to take care of a lot. At the level of the human, you barely had to take care of anything. At the level of pure like space-like surrender, there's nothing to do because everything is taken care of itself. That is the direction you're moving in with surrender. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because at the level of pure surrender, everything's already accepted. There's no pressure. The nature of everything is flow and self-improvement. So there's nothing inhibiting you benefiting from the nature of flow and self-improvement. Everything that you sought to improve will naturally happen of its own accord because you're no longer restricting it with those distorted old ways of looking at it and fighting against the experience. Uh, but I digress. I mentioned that surrender is space-like. And essentially I say that because, well, stop whatever it is you're doing, your process of surrender right now. Shake yourself out a bit. tighten your muscles if you need to, build up some pressure, some tension, make yourself feel like a normal, kind of somewhat shitty human being, okay? Um, and yeah, just notice an area of like tension or pressure, not total comfort. And now that you have that in your awareness, start to feel the space that's within and around it. Like, disregard what's inside of the space. Just notice, oh yeah, there's space amidst this. Oh yeah, there's space around this. Now check. Even though boundaries and definitions appear in the space, is the space itself bounded? No, no, it's not. There's a lot of space. And even though we started off with checking out the space of a particular area, we can quickly start to notice that since the space is boundless, it actually extends into our entire experience. It's a space that includes the big and the small. Now, notice that the space, there's movement within the space. Those are what you call your sensations. There's a natural fluidity to the space expressing a sensation. Let yourself be carried by the flow of space, or the flow that appears within the space. Allowing the space to almost pour or melt into itself, regardless of the form that seems to be appearing or it seems to be taking. And at this point, just let yourself fall into infinite space that's with all your sensations. Disregarding what seems to be happening at the level of the sensory, just appreciate, fall into the sense of space that gives rise to it. And that leads to relief, expansion. Things feel easier, calmer. You notice that, right?
Yeah.
Now, whatever remains of the discomfort, if there is anything left, is there anything left?
A little bit.
All right. So take that microscopic peck of a little bit. Understanding that space is infinite, also understand that it has infinite depth too. So allow yourself to fall into the infinite space, the infinite sensation, the infinite feeling of that area that remains. And for me, it's kind of like usually our attention will approach things as a surface and like start to interact as that. Well, with this, it's more like, oh, you don't even have to do that. Just continue feeling along the dimension of space. Instead of doing this, just do this. Just keep going. And this is where things start to get really cool. Because now the like chaotic core of what was uncomfortable has kind of cooled down. It's become much more space-like itself. And you've started to approach a kind of singularity where, since the space is infinitely vast in size and infinitely small in terms of how micro you can get, spiraling infinitely into a small space, you realize, wow, there's actually no size, no scale to the space. there seem to be relative sizes and scales to the things that appear within it, but the space itself, it's neither big nor small. It's just omnipresent. What appears within the space shifts, giving the illusion that the space itself is changing, but the space itself is just still the space. And the more that you remember, that you become conscious of the space quality, well, what do you notice about space? What are some of its qualities? What does it allow you to feel when you feel so much space?
It's open.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of, I guess, free. What else is there? Free. Empty. I could call it empty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the more space you feel, the more pronounced the sense of space feels, the more you feel those things. Now, there's always space, and you're used to ignoring it. Surrender, letting go, processing, acceptance, all of those things engage a quality of space. You become more conscious to it. So the sense of release, acceptance, and equanimity that arises naturally through these practices, the end result is just you being more conscious of space. If you become conscious of space often enough, eventually it just becomes parts of your baseline. You always notice the quality of space. And instead of being something subtle in the background, it becomes as important, as conscious, as tangible as everything else. When the quality of the purity of space is on equal footing with the phenomenal, when they're inseparable, same taste, then you always have peace. You always have freedom. You always have ease. Because now things are in balance. Space is the formless side of the formed coin of all the things that we're usually observing. So that's the first thing. Any comments or questions on that little tidbit before I move forward?
Space? No.
Okay. Yeah, in a very certain kind of way, you're never really feeling sensation, you're just feeling space. And you're feeling parts of the space that express in a certain way that we call those subdivisions like sensation. But it's always just the space. It's always within and made of the space. So if you fully open up into the space of your experience, oh, you're also kind of opening yourself up to feel, accept, and surrender everything. Now, here's the other side of the coin. The space, as well as what arises within the space, are made of something. Something that can appear as space and is empty, or something that can appear as something, as formed, as full. When we engage... you sneezed, you fucked up the flow. Alright, I'll catch you next week, buddy. Yeah, you gotta be careful, man. And the dust around you gets in the way of the Shakti pot. Yeah, there's something deeper that gives rise to the sense of space or form. And that in and of itself, that's what we're kind of starting to engage when we invite the sense of wonder or awe or beauty or mystery or the question mark or love or source. All of these like beyond belief, bigger than life kind of qualities that people put up on a pedestal, they take you to a dimension of experience that literally transcends space. It's more potent, pure, and fuller, while also inherently containing the space-like qualities, even though it doesn't really feel like space anymore. It just feels like a fullness. It feels like a warmth to me. So, noticing the quality of space that you've kind of been chilling with, and yeah, within this space of feeling, let's just drop a little stone, a little intention, a seed of, oh, wonder. And instead of making it happen, you just let it drop. And you start to notice that, oh, okay, the ocean-like space is starting to be flavored ever so subtly by a subtle warmth. And it starts small at first, but just notice, oh yeah, it's flavoring things. Let yourself fall into the space of the wonder, however subtle it is. Kind of like you're feeding the glow, feeding the warmth, pouring yourself into it. And as you pour yourself into it, it fuels it. It gets brighter, warmer. It starts to saturate more and more of the field. And just let yourself fall with the understanding that there is no bottom. It's just falling. And do you notice how enjoyable it's getting?
Yeah.
It's like it starts off as a little bit of warmth, but it's kind of like the filament, the little cotton thing in a light bulb that gets electrified and that lights up. The more electricity running through it, the brighter it gets. As you pour your awareness into this deeper matrix of feeling, this deeper space of feeling, it amplifies the brightness of your consciousness, your nervous system. And that gives rise to a sense of wholeness, of coherence. Like you can feel everything within and outside of you more clearly. The lights are really on. That's the more feminine, Shakti-like aspect, in my opinion. But yeah, it's purer than space. It's deeper than space. The space gives you the peace, the wonder, or whatever variation of it that you want to go for that invites a sense of coherence. That gives you a tangible sense of brightness, of like there being a sun in this space, that it leans positive, and it's a more enjoyable way to live. That also starts to become your baseline. The more you practice it, the more you dip into it, it's like, well, the wonder is kind of always there in the background because it's literally the sun of experience. It's just been on low power, low volume. And when we invite the idea of wonder, when we invite the feeling of love, all of these things that are different ways of thinking or feeling about it, we're engaging that. And as we pour ourselves into it, we're increasing the volume of it. So that now we can clearly taste what's always been in the background, the sun that illuminates the entire sky of the space that we've been playing in. So now you have the space and you have the warmth. And between these two qualities, you have a pretty balanced nervous system. The space engages more of your parasympathetic, your relaxation response, your melting into relaxation. a vast openness that's unconstrained, no tension, no pressure. The warmth invites and balances arousal, the sympathetic nervous system, except instead of being incoherent or what's a good way of describing it? It's kind of like a raggedy, rough-edged, like coherence, arousal that anger gives off. Instead of it being that kind of arousal of like anger or like aggression, it's the arousal of yes to life. And it's much softer than other forms of arousal that we're used to, but the point is that it's naturally motivating. There's a natural enthusiasm to it. And it also gives you a sense of infinite potential, like you can do anything. Because the deeper you go into the wonder and the space, the more you're not fabricating and remembering all of the limitations you think you've learned about yourself in the world, which means you're starting from a pure slate, a blanker slate. And that also means that your imagination, your mind, is more unbounded. This gives you more freedom and flexibility to be creative in terms of how you go about your life. All of this stuff can work at an intentions notice. It's like if I ever want to become more conscious of space, because at this point, like give me one moment. Yeah, if I ever want to call upon the sense of space and make it more pronounced, because at this point it's unignorable, like there's always a quality of space here. If I ever want to call upon it, I just have the intention arise of, oh, fall into the space. And I feel the sense of space getting more pronounced around, within, and to itself. And there's no end. I can just keep going. It's very refreshing. Deepens the sense of the relaxation response in the body, greater sense of energetic flow. Cool. Now, if I want to call upon warmth, I just intend to feel the warmth. And just allow myself to melt and flow and fall into it. And that really warms up my body, increases my sense of blood flow, brings a sense of warmth to my face, a smile, and an excitement to kind of just share myself and experience with the world because, hey, things are nice, let's share it. If I were to spend a decent chunk of time at the beginning of my day just allowing myself to cultivate and amplify the sense of space and warmth, which I guess now we can say, let's do that at the same time. The infinite space of warmth. This slowly starts to, as it continues to deepen the effects of everything else, of the relaxation and everything, it's also like it's tuning my nervous system, it's tuning my mind. You don't want to start your day out of tune. If you do this every morning, if you do this in the middle of the day, heck, I like to say you can dip into this for at least a few seconds, quite a few times every hour. When you get good at it, it's like, okay, I'm gonna consciously engage the space, the infinite space of warmth as I speak. I'm gonna allow speaking to be an expression of the ever expanding space and warmth, so that in my direct experience, what we were practicing as formal is now what I'm primarily experiencing, even as I'm speaking. And it's like, oh yeah, I can move my hand, I can pick up my phone, I can read, I can type, all while this continuous sense of infinite warmth and space is developing and amplifying itself. That's a very divine-like quality to the experience. There's never a time when you can't do this. The more often you do it, the more often your nervous system gets used to just being this way. Your consciousness gets used to just being this way. When that stabilizes and sticks, that's a different way that people have measured and considered the spectrum of awakening. As it deepens further, there are deeper layers of your subconscious that it untangles, and it has even more wonderful benefits, such as healing the body and allowing you to access like deeper powers and perceptive abilities. All from this very simple way of being. Because I fail to describe it as a practice because it's not apart from anything. It can be practiced in the midst, it can be done in the midst of anything. It's not separate from anything. And so I invite you to engage with this more as a way of being. That we have forgotten that we can be in this way, and that when we manifest the intention to engage in this, we're just remembering a way of being. And being is quite the choice word, because it's not a doing. Because the moment after the intention has manifested, you're just allowing, you're just being with it. Any comments or questions?
Is this a form of surrender?
Bitch! What do you think, Kevin? Is this a form of surrender? Consider it for a moment. How could it be? How could it not be? Everything we do is surrender, man. It's just a different way of talking about what surrender gets you to. If you can understand this, you don't even need the concept of surrender, because it's just direct. It's like, oh, I've forgotten the sense of like unbounded continuous space. It's always here. Wow. Let me just remember that I'm being an idiot. Why am I totally ignoring that? Oh, cool, I'm conscious of it again. There's the peace, there's the openness, the equanimity. It makes it a lot easier to flow and deal with life. Gosh, why would I want to live life without the quality of space? Oh, okay. Warmth. I'm feeling like empty and neutral, but I don't feel very joyful. I don't feel like really doing anything. I just sit still and be neutral. It's like, well, okay. Let me just remember what it is to be warm, to be the sun, to be light. And there you go. And in all of these processes, acceptance is part of it. Non-resistance is part of it. It's natural. It's a natural side effect. So rather than needing the action of surrender so you can let go of resistance, surrender is a natural part of just remembering this way of being. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. This is a direct way of working with your consciousness that transcends the mind and the body. Every technique, practice and variation on surrender, on practicing, on meditation. There are simply different ways of conceptually approximating how to achieve these shifts directly. As such, everything prior can still lead to these very same results, but they become less necessary the more direct access you have. So, for as long as you still on occasion find yourself under the illusion of having forgotten something, having forgotten how easy it is to just be at ease, how easy it is to just be warm. If you do not remember the directness of how easy it is, at the very least you'll remember a technique that approximates it, that makes it easier to remember. And that's how all of this fits in. When you understand it directly, there's no need for technique or practicing. As scaffolding, as crutches, as training wheels, before you've gotten familiar enough with this way of being, we have the idea of practice, the idea of technique, the idea of approaches. And there you have it. Any comments or questions on anything today, good sir?
So this is something that occurs to me during episodes in particular, but sometimes it can happen outside of it. And this has been like uh, a major difficulty, and it's something like I might be like surrendering or something. I might be like, well, what if I forget how to surrender? Or what does surrender mean? Or how do I know what that means? Or something like that. This is like a question that gets posed in my mind. It's like a self-sabotaging question because um, it it arouses an anxiety response because it makes me like confused. Like, yeah, what if I do forget how to surrender? Uh, if I don't know what that means,
Yeah,
or
it's kind of like getting lost in a thought loop of, what if there is no God? What if, yeah, what if there is no God? Wow, everything else, but what if there isn't? Or what if peace is impossible? What if happiness is impossible? Ah! That's essentially what you're doing. You can always imagine what it's like, what it might be like, that it might be possible for something to not occur. That doesn't mean that it's likely or ever will. It's just your imagination. Hence why, the better question is, it's like, how do you even know it would be possible to forget? It's like you question the questioning because you've already made like a really shitty assumption that it would be possible. And if you're humble and honest enough, you don't know enough to make any claims or start on those hypotheses. There's never been a person that's written a book of like, yo, what if you forget how to surrender? Because it's not a real issue. It doesn't exist. But the moment you think of it, you imagine it, it seems like it's possible. It seems real. So that's just not being an idiot with your mind. Like, your mind can imagine a bunch of scenarios that are like highly ludicrous and impossible and very uncomfortable as you're getting lost into it. And so what I ask you is, as those kinds of thoughts arise, what if I forget how to surrender? What are those thoughts arising within? Like, where are they?
space, I guess.
You bitch, you knew I was going here. And yeah, just notice, wow, are the thoughts made of space? Are they different from the space?
No.
Yeah, and do you notice how that kind of relieves the pressure of those thoughts as you consider that? When you focus on the space that makes up things rather than the things themselves, it kind of helps the things kind of self-liberate and be put into perspective. Do those thoughts seem as frightening when you understand them in the context of space?
Yeah.
Hmm?
What? Yeah.
Yeah, what?
To the question, or I don't even remember what the question was.
Do they seem as frightening when you consider them in the context of space?
No.
Yeah. And so here's the thing. Whenever you actually go crazy, whenever you actually have an episode, you're hyper concentrating on a specific subset of experience, a set of sensations that you deem uncomfortable, and or a set of thoughts that are quite alarming. You hyper focus and you stay locked in. You forget how the space that they arise in, how peaceful it is, how much perspective you do have. And it's harder to access a sense of ease that comes with it. Given that most of the time you do remember, well, the answer is always remember. Because the more often that you remember, the more natural it becomes and the harder it is to forget until eventually it's impossible to forget. So no matter like what we're talking about, it just invites you to actualize the experience now. Because if you're entertaining what if I forget how to surrender, that would suggest you still remember how. So why not surrender now and see what things feel like when you've surrendered past the idea of what if I don't? And yeah, that is a very effective way of like just cutting off at the root before it develops into a substantial problem of like, oh, I've been spending 5 minutes, half an hour continuously beating my head against a wall trying to figure out what do I do if I can't remember how to surrender. The agony of that hellish like experience that only exists in my mind. Anything else?
Hmm. So I doubt I could like do that in the midst of an episode because of um, just the state of my mind during an episode and how it can be like, even if it's like, what if I, what if I forget how to surrender? Well, you can't. Or even if I do surrender that, it'll be there's there has been responses where you're like, well, watch me try to forget. I'll actively try to forget, or at least a part of me is trying to forget.
Yeah, and surrender in the midst of trying to forget. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you throw up or what defenses or how you try to self sabotage. The self sabotage isn't important. You're bigger than that. You can practice through it, you can see through it. And so at that point, it just becomes a choice of who are you actually? What are you actually? Are you a seasoned and experienced and mature practitioner that has had hours upon hours of experience upon countless years that is pretty seasoned? You're ready to handle this? Or are you some snotty nosed kid that's like scared and struggling against this big baddie and it just has no idea? It's like, no. It's like you're bigger than everything inside of you, including the self sabotage. Because essentially, it's like, okay, surrender, surrender, surrender. Oh, what if I forget how to surrender and you get stuck here? You stop surrendering. But then you remember, okay, you know what? Let me surrender through this. So you've surrendered what if. Okay, surrender again. And now you're like, oh, let me try to actively not surrender. Let me try to actively forget. Oh, well, I guess I don't have to stop there either. I can keep going. Your mind can only offer potentialities, not realities. Just because it suggests something doesn't mean it is so. You get to decide how it goes. And yeah, I'll put it to you this way. I went through a very heavy psychedelic phase in my like early 20s. And during that time, I faced states of hell, states of madness, like actual crazy mental and psychological imbalances for periods of time. I experienced those things and were stuck in them because I had yet to understand the nature of my mind. I had yet to stabilize a certain clarity. And so after I'd gotten around to practicing this stuff and like, you know, actualizing it more deeply, by that point I'd already like given up using psychedelics regularly. I'd occasionally try them again. Except now things were different. There's a sense of something that can never be forgotten. So even though I could have a very intense trip where my senses were melting, I couldn't make sense of my mind. Like my mind was incoherent. My mind was not working. There is a deeper quality of consciousness which transcends the mind, which had stabilized and helped keep everything in context. I never lose the sense of space. Very recently, I decided, hey, let me like take a small dose of mushrooms on a Saturday. This ended up being much more powerful than what a small dose should be. And very, very quickly, my brain's ability to process sensory information collapsed, and my ability to hold a coherent thought collapsed. And I was like just assaulted by the most intense primordial paranoia and fear. The fear that something had gone terribly wrong, that I was suffering through something psychophysiological that I could not come back from, that maybe I should call an ambulance. And even still, in the midst of all of that, the clarity of, this is strange. I don't know what's going on, but I know I'm resisting. Let me just surrender into it. Everything is impermanent. It's just a matter of time. And I did. And eventually, after an hour and a half, the heavier effects subsided, the mind started to regain its coherence and clarity, and the body calmed down, and everything was groovy. I would not have been able to do that, to flow through that experience when I was younger. I could have really gotten fucked up. And so the proof is in the pudding. You start to find hairier and hairier situations that you would have gotten lost or fucked up by, but instead it just doesn't happen because now you just understand. You can't really lose your maturity, your wisdom, and the intelligence that you build off these kinds of practices because they're deep than your mind. So even when your mind is unable to think or work normally, these things can still be active and working. Make sense?
Yeah.
Any other comments or questions?
You mentioned something earlier about if you practice enough, it just won't go away. I think it was in reference to space or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So like if you access the quality of space or the quality of the warmth and the space
Mm-hmm.
enough times, that quality just won't go away.
Well, first of all, here's the understanding. It has never not been there. Okay? The second thing is, it's so subtle and our mind is oriented to focus on the gross that we usually don't notice it initially. It's still there. It's still the baseline of our experience. It's what we feel when we're not focusing on anything else. It's where we've gotten the taste of all of our peak experiences and surrender from. Those are the very same qualities. It's always there. When you remember them, you're intending to increase their volume to such a degree that now they're noticeable. But after you get more and more familiar noticing it at the greater volume, it's also noticeable at the lower volume, and also the baseline volume just increases. So to answer your question, yes, eventually you do not forget. I wouldn't necessarily describe it as it doesn't go away, because it can't. It's part of the fundamental building structures of your perception. Like, as long as you're existing as a conscious human being, you can't be without these fundamental qualities. So that's why I put it in the context of remembering and turning up the volume. And yeah, eventually it becomes integrated with everything. So meaning that you always notice everything in terms of space, in terms of warmth. You notice your mind, your emotions in those terms. And the qualities of processing and healing are just natural to your way of being, because that's what happens when you're infinite warmth space. It's like everything just flows through you. You don't resist. You have a higher degree of wisdom and coherence and sensitivity. So, yeah. Anything else?
Hmm.
And honestly, you can just look back in your past and notice like your own evolution. Like, it's like, as you put it, it's a little difficult to put my finger on, but yeah, it's kind of there. It's like, if you really look back, it's like, no, there's like a much deeper and more consistent quality of peace that you now have access to that was not there 3 years ago. It's just so subtle and it's so non-substantial, and your mind is so used to focusing on substantial that you don't notice. But when you slow down and someone like puts the spotlight on you, and it's just like, yeah, it's kind of always there. Everything is kind of always okay, like more and more and more than ever before. So the proof is already in your pudding. It's like you just haven't fully stabilized like the consciousness of it, but the volume of your baseline spaciousness has increased. All right. You got one final comment or question, then I'm cutting you off.
If I notice something uncomfortable, can I just surrender through that? Or does that make sense? like go about my day. If I notice something uncomfortable, just surrender through that and release that discomfort, and go about doing that for as often as I feel uncomfortable, which is actually almost all the time. But that's besides the point.
I mean, I'd suggest to see a doctor if you're uncomfortable all the time. I mean, probably exercise a bit, do some stretching, like move more. The fuck. Yeah, if you're feeling habitually uncomfortable, your body's probably like not in the greatest state of health. And like there are some things that you should probably shift in terms of your daily habits to ensure that that remains more fluid. Because a good chunk of times, a lot of times, a lot of like the things that we feel may not actually have like some deeper psychological or emotional or energetic thing. It's just our body not being totally healthy. So, yeah, yeah. Uh, God, if I could offer you a simple program that you could watch and engage in, that would take care of that. Huh. Sometime. Yeah, man. Look, surrender is surrender, no matter what the context, no matter what your beginning point is. The key is that as you go through the process of surrender, let go of your, like, your attachment to certain outcomes, your expectations, your desire for a certain kind of result. You may start off with that, but in the process, in order to master surrender, everything must be let go. So you can start from anywhere. You can start under any context. Just let everything fade of its own accord the deeper that you go. That's pretty much it.
Okay.
With that said, I'll catch you on the flip side, good sir.
All right.
Peace.
Take care.